Okay, so good evening, folks, and welcome to tonight's session, which is based around our how to lower inputs, which we had in the summer session. So we put together a take two based on the feedback from the previous session. Tonight we've got Brian Barker, Rob Fox, and David Aglen as a Strategic Farm trio, and we've got Georgina Key and Mark Topliff with us from AHDB as well. So tonight we're going to go through a little bit on current market trends and where we are with pricing and structure, and then we're going to move on to Georgina, who's going to take us through a few of the tools from the horticulture world, which may be able to advance our knowledge in the cereal world now as things tend to progress on down. So on the next slide, as we progress through, there we are. So obviously tonight everybody's on mute. Questions, there's a question panel down on the side there. We'll try and stick to time. I think we're due to finish about 8:30, just before the jungle starts. Basis and Enroso points, if you can pop them into the questions task. So just on your right hand side, if you click on the questions part and just pop your basis and Enroso numbers in there. And we will be recording the session tonight, just so it can be played back on YouTube. If you want to see us on Twitter, our Scottish Strategic Farm comes under the @AHDB Scott, so you'll see us there, and Sheila will pick that up and respond if you wish to get in contact. So first off, I think we're going to kick off with a poll, which I think Christian should have ready. So the first question: did you see a return on fungicide application? So to open the poll, you have to click the little double window there to take you out of it, and then it will let you click the button and you can expand it back. So an interesting season question first off, just to set the scene on this, to see where people are on it, monitoring it. So as we see, the numbers going up.
I'll just give it another 5 seconds or so, getting a few more coming in.
Yeah, we're quite quick in here with the poll for a start. We thought we'll keep everyone on their toes, just to see.
I'll close it now. I think it's starting to slow down.
Wow, okay, so we've 46% suggesting, yep, they did see a response, return on fungicide application. 21% saying some, 18 no, and 15 not quite sure. So again, you know, we're talking all across the UK here. Bring Brian in at that stage. What was your thoughts on that, Brian?
You've got off script there because I was expecting the next question, but never mind. Yeah, that's probably, I was expecting probably more people to see a response, but that's about what I expected. It's interesting that some don't know. It would be how we can sort of make them sort of be a bit more understanding of their fungicide application and returns from this panel tonight. So it'll be interesting to see what happens. So go from that.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, and we'll move on. So we've got Mark Topliff coming in just now with a few slides, which you'd have seen Mark and I did a little session on the Grain Outlook Week. So there's a few interesting trends came out of the data there that Mark managed to present. So I'll hand over to Mark for that one.
Thanks, Chris. And yes, I'm just going to provide some context tonight, really, to discussions which are going to be had. So looking around the sort of current and recent input prices for some key inputs and what we've seen in the cost reduction trends as well over the last sort of 2 or 3 years. So without further ado, then let's have a look at the recent trends that we've seen, some key price inputs. And this chart that's on the left here is drawn from DEFRA published figures, which show the trend as an index of some of the key inputs prices to September this year. And what we've seen noticeably over the last 12 months is definitely some key input prices have changed relatively little, while others have shifted quite significantly. So, for example, the loss of some of the cheaper fungicides and herbicide products from the market has left the more expensive products. So you can see there those two lines have changed quite noticeably. over the recent sort of 12 months or so. But in contrast, we've seen fertilizer prices being low this year. Nitrate prices have dropped as there's weaker demand for the products. Overall, there was lower production costs due to gas prices being lower than last year. However, in sort of reversal of those factors, we have seen fertilizer prices increasing of recent weeks. So that has changed back again. Seed prices.
Mark, when you're on this, this is actual cost. This is not cost per hectare. This is actual cost of the original product, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the price of the product. Yeah, that's right.
It's not per litre. It's not. It is the actual cost. It's not the cost of a program or anything else. It's the physical cost.
It's the physical product you buy. So what you buy in your container or what you buy from your merchant. It's a basket of those prices for those inputs. That's right. Seed prices haven't changed much as much as the other inputs, although we are seeing some increases in recent weeks, generally in line with what we see with the grain prices. And I've just added in there as well the fuel prices, and that took quite a significant dive in 2020 with the reduced demand due to the COVID-19 pandemic driving down crude oil pricing, and so that had a knock-on effect on red diesel costs as well. So that's what we've seen in terms of input prices. One of the key questions, I suppose, what's being asked is what's going to be the impact moving forward, and certainly in the short to medium term, what possibly may impact on those prices. I mean, the short answer is to say it's difficult to say exactly what those prices will do, but there's certainly 4 key areas I think we need to be aware of which may influence those prices. Firstly is what's going to happen with the trade deal with the EU. So if we don't get an EU, then there will be probably tariffs applied to the inputs we have to import, and we do import most of our crop protection products, most of our fertilizer. Even though we've got some fertilizer production capacity in the UK, we still have to import quite a significant amount, and so those sort of products will be subject to a tariff of about sort of 6% if there's no trade deal to allow free trade with the EU. The other reason that we may see some change in future prices is those additional border checks. Those imports, those inputs, you know, they will have to probably go through additional checks. It will vary from product to product depending on what it is, but there'll certainly be some checks on those imports, and that takes time. It takes administration and adds into the supply chain. So possibly some friction, as we call it, in terms of costs there. Then there may be delays at ports should the new border controls slow down the passage of imports through the ports. Generally speaking, bulk imports such as sort of fertilizer are expected to experience less delays than the imports coming through what we call the short straits, which is the sort of Dover-Calais route, which potentially could be a bottleneck. So again, depending on what route they come through, we may see delays, and certainly initially, while you know new systems are being getting used to and that sort of thing. So again, potentially it could add to friction costs on those imports. And then last but not least is certainly the exchange rate, and that's the one that's most difficult to try and forecast and what impact could be, whether it's positive or negative. And it all depends on the reaction of the money markets to the situation come the 1st of January, when we're meant to have a new trading deal or not with the EU. So those are the sort of things we need to keep an eye on, just in terms of how they may affect those inputs that we're buying onto our farms. Moving on to the next slide, then we've also had a look at the recent trends in cost production, and this is providing 2 years worth of actual cost production figures from our Farmbench figures, the AHDB Farmbench figures, which for 2018 and 19. And then I tried to provide an estimate of what we think the 2020 cost production figures may look like. So at this moment in time, this is an estimate. But certainly if you look at the those costs for those particular crops on the per hectare basis, you can see that for wheat, cost per hectare look like they've fallen about 3% on average due to reduction in the key input costs. Both spring barley and winter oilseed rape are predicted to have seen about a 4% drop in total cost of production per hectare. Now that's overall, you know, they've dropped, but if we then factor in the yields that we've seen in these crops, so we now reveal what the pounds per ton figures are, please, Christian. Because we've generally seen that yields have been reported to be lower this year, then that actually may impact on the cost of production on a per ton basis. So for wheat there, you can see that we think for 2020 there'll be an increase of something around about sort of £20 per ton in those costs because of that fall in the yield. Spring barley, if we just reveal the figure there, again a sort of slight increase, not as great as what we've seen with winter wheat because of the yield not being quite as low as what we've seen with the winter wheat. And then for winter oilseed rape, the pound per ton figure there, if we just reveal that, is up a significant sort of roundabout sort of £30 per ton. So all in all, when you look at these sort of trends and the impact of yield on these cost production figures, there's probably no better time to try and better optimize inputs to try and maximize those margins. So I'll leave it at that and hand back to Chris.
Yeah, thanks very much for that, Mark. Very striking figures there as they actually hit you in the face, aren't they? It's going to be difficult to try and achieve the cost of production target there for price sold. You know, and an interesting trend that's been shown, you know, the margin from the inputs since the World War has just been shrinking and shrinking as we go. So, you know, there has to be looking and research into other ways, which is where the strategic farm comes into, and things that we're trying to do there to try and beat the standard. You know, so a little quote there. You know, the edge of what we know is the beginning of what's possible. So who knows where we might go in the future? And a few of the trials that we'll move on to on the next slide here, I'll show you some of the work that we've been doing with our business groups up in Scotland. So this was courtesy of Walker Munro Farms up in Angus. And this was a Sundance and a Motown blend that went in completely to the field. Now the centre of the field was untreated and the headland was a full fungicide programme. So we monitored this throughout the season using field view, and you can see there on April. So the red bits on the outside is actually some of the trees, as you'll see, and going through. By the time we get to June, July, you can really see the green area there on the fungicide applied trial coming into fruition, thinking, you know, what a difference here. We were seeing a bit of septoria in the field, a little bit of rust, manageable, I would have said, and not that huge that you'd be rushing out to get the sprayer in the untreated. And then as we move on to the next slide, you can, you know, really see that highlighted here and the end rig. So the 36 metre spray around the outside was sprayed full fungicide programme and just left the middle to see what would happen. And then on the next slide, the yield map at the end, which shocked all of us. Did not expect to see that. So yes, we know the ins and outs of yield maps within this, but you know, we were expecting to see this followed through to yield. Now, what happened this year, it'll lead us on to our next poll question. You know, we really didn't expect to see the yield map to come out even, and even with the ins and outs, this is unclean data, so it is just straight off class combine, straight into gatekeeper, as you can see, and straight back out there. We were expecting to see the headland sticking out like a sore thumb, as we'd seen the field health all the way through, but didn't prove to be the case, and not seen by the combine driver into yield. So if we move on to our next poll, which should come up. So was last year a high or a low disease pressure year? So the poll should be open now, and if you click the little window tab at the side. That should let you be able to tick a box. So it's the two windows that'll just sort of blip the screen a little bit, and then that'll let you select a box on the screen in front of you. And then we'll see what people thought of it. Certainly in Scotland, I would probably have classed it as a fairly low disease pressure year, and a few, you know, as you can see from a few of the trial results, the untreateds were certainly holding their own in most of the trial results there. So, you know, again, you've got to look at this going back to the cost of production there that Mark was telling us about, you know, that £150 a tonne. Anything we can do to lower that, it has to be a benefit. Okay, yeah, so I see most people there coming back with a moderate to low, which is good to see. That would certainly be my recollection. Rob, we'll bring you in on this one. What was your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty much where we thought it would be across most of the UK. A low disease year, not a huge response to your fungicides. Certainly over here in the west, yeah, we were a low disease year. And it's years like this that we need to be able to make the decisions to reduce those sprays, isn't it, and make the most of these low disease years when they do hit.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, we follow through the IPM programs to try and do that, but you know, you always have to have a little look back at the end to see whether the end result has been what you thought it would be. You know, and it's crystal ball stuff. How far could you have cut it back? So in our next session here, we're going to bring in Georgina Key and just move into some of the things that the horticulture world have been doing. Now, this has been a big interest to me for the last 2 or 3 years, and through our Scottish groups, you know, we've put a lot into the hort world, because, you know, these guys have some very high value crops that they're dealing with, and some of the technology that they're using there is now actually not beyond us in terms of cost to be rolling out in our crops. And part of that is to try and see nutrition of these crops can get us most of the way there before we maybe need to reach for the can or make a decision as to what to do. So we'll bring in Georgina and we'll have a bit of discussion as we go through this. There's some fairly interesting points as we go.
Hi everyone. This is a bit of a venture out of my comfort zone coming into. Oh, can you see me twice or no?
You're fine as it is. It just sometimes appears on your screen, so you're good as you are.
I might minimise myself, otherwise I'll distract myself my own face. Right. Okay, so I work in the horticulture sector in AHDB, and I'm just going to run through some of the stuff that horticulture growers use to monitor their crop, mostly from the point of nutrition, but I'll touch on a bit of water and PGRs as well. Let's see if this will move. It's not going on to the next slide.
Was it not playing ball? Don't worry, I can start showing it from my slide again. If you...
Oh, hang on. Wait a second. Oh, it found it. Okay.
Okay.
Perfect. All right. So I thought I'd start off giving you a little bit of context about horticulture. So I think if you hear horticulture, a lot of people just think flowers and gardening, and actually it's all of the soft fruit like strawberries, etc. It's tree fruit, it's carrots, it's leafy vegetables, it's all your herbs, tomatoes, cucumbers, things like that, and of course ornamentals. On the left hand side here you can see a glass house which is entirely strawberries. You can't actually see the other end of the glass house, so it's just one huge monoculture in a controlled environment. On the other side you've got an ornamentals grower, and this particular grower has something like 4,000 different product lines, so that could be 4,000 different species or different sized pots or whatever. So there's a huge diversity of crop in some of these businesses. It's not just in controlled environments, it's also outside in the elements, and it covers everything from, you know, small plants to big trees. One of the issues that horticulture really faces is consistency of product. So quality and visual quality is a really, really difficult thing to keep consistent. So all of these carrots, this is Hunter Pack in Lancashire, all of these carrots will be nigh on identical. And you know, having to manage your inputs to try and produce such a consistent product is is a nightmare, especially when you get squeezed by supermarkets and other retailers. Your margins are very, very small, so it's worth keeping a close eye on what you're putting into your crop. So people in horticulture, there are sort of 4 main areas which they will analyze regularly. So irrigation water, obviously, if you're in a glass house, you know, you're completely dependent on your water source rather than just rain. And depending on what your water source, you can get a different quality of water, and it can affect how available different nutrients are. So most people will be testing their irrigation water. They'll also test their soil if they're out in the field, or in their substrate, so their growing media. So this can come as a bulk load or a bale, like you can see here, or it can come in bags. And they will test it before they use it, and they will also test it after it's been in the pot for a while, and they'll take it out of the pot and take a sample from the middle of the soil. The nutrient
George,
solution,
on your soil sample, what kind of soil sampling? Is it just the standard NPK pH, or is it way in depth, sort of Albrecht style, or?
So that will depend on the crop. So in the photo on the bottom right, you can see there, that's hardy nursery stock. So that's a shrub. It's pretty hardy. It can deal with quite a lot really before it starts to show any problems. So yeah, it would probably just be the standard NPK. If it was something that was a bit more sensitive, like a young plant or a herb, something like that, which doesn't have a long growing lifespan before it's sold, then you'd keep a much closer eye on all the micronutrients as well. And they also, of course, have issues with nitrates. So all the leafy salad producers, they've got to be really careful about the amount of nitrates and chlorates in their crops. So they'll be keeping a really close eye on all of those nutrients.
And how would you go about adjusting that if you were, you know, so if you do go and soil sample, would they, you know, because obviously they're in control of the soil there, which is slightly simpler than most farming businesses. But, you know, presumably they would control this by applications of product.
Yeah, so in a pot, yes, it would be controlled by applications of product, changing fertilizer rates. They will also do flush throughs of systems, and you can also do flushing in fields, although admittedly it is a lot harder. I think the main thing to remember about this is if it's grown in a container, your nutrient status can change incredibly quickly. It's a lot slower if it's in the soil, you know, and if you're doing all the things that you know, that are good practice, like liming and, you know, not taking liming holidays and all of these sort of things, then you are less likely to have these issues further down the line, and you won't need to do remedial practices in the same way that someone growing in a container might have to.
So how quickly, so if you're sampling, and for instance, like if you change the soil over, how quickly would you see depletion of minerals in the soil affect the plant health?
So do you mean in the soil, or do you mean in the substrate?
In the substrate, sorry, talking to
substrate. So that would depend on the crop that's being grown. So if you've got a really vigorous crop, it could be very, very quick. That pot there, that could last for several weeks with a slow release fertilizer in. If it's a much smaller pot, so, you know, if you go to your B&Q and you buy those primroses or pansies in the teeny tiny packs, you know, you need to be feeding every couple of days. So nutrients can run out very, very quickly. Yeah.
And if you manage to keep feeding it, you can keep the health status of the plant, which I know you're coming on to, but yeah. Yeah,
you can. Yeah. So I've just flagged up some prices of you know, average sort of prices for the analyses that a grower would do in a year or 18 months. So as well as testing the substrate or the soil, they will test the nutrient solution. So that's the when they dissolve their fertilizers and make a stock solution, they will measure it before it goes on. And if you're in a glass house, sometimes you collect the runoff or the leachate from your plants, and they will measure that as well to make sure that there's not a build up, and that if there's too much coming off, then they're feeding their plants too much. So they keep a really close eye, and that's often measured using an EC meter, an electrical conductivity meter. This is a particularly expensive one. You can get cheaper ones, and it just measures the total salts in the water in the solution that you're using. And it just, you know, if your EC is really, really high, it means you're feeding your crops too much, or you aren't aren't adding enough water, things like that. And it's the same for in the soil as well. You know, it can give an indication of what the buildup of nutrients in your soil is. And finally, they can also do leaf or sap analyses, and they'll collect leaves throughout the year and freeze them and send them off in batches. Something to bear in mind about this is in the UK, we tend to test leaves and sap samples if we think there's a problem. In places like Germany, they tend to do analyses and sampling to prevent problems. So they do it just to keep an eye on things throughout the season and anticipate problems coming up. So there are sort of cultural differences between countries as well in terms of sampling.
I was just going to ask, if I may, Georgie,
Yep.
over the years with all this extra analysis,
Yeah.
have you seen a trend with the horticultural industry applying more inputs or less inputs? Are they using this to reduce what they thought they needed, or are they using this to actually apply more and get more from the crop?
It's to reduce generally. Okay. Yeah, I mean, some cases it's about fine tuning. So because things can change in substrate and container crops so quickly, they do monitor a lot just to make sure they don't miss something. But also they have to be incredibly fine tuned in some of these crops. So it's worth spending the money to make those adjustments, because you will get a better quality crop. The other thing, I'm not sure what it's like in cereals and oilseeds, but in horticulture, you get a lot of issue with shelf life. So, you know, you want your carrot to last well on the shelf. You want your bagged salad to last well on the shelf. And, you know, with plants, you don't want to buy a plant and then it'll die on you the next day. So shelf life and longevity is quite a big issue. And reducing your inputs can actually have a beneficial effect on that shelf life. Sometimes if you're mollycoddling and feeding your plants too much, they basically go soft and they don't last in the same way. So it has benefits not just for reducing cost in inputs, but also in terms of better quality products at the end.
And how much of an issue do you think is there of suppliers coming up with ways of telling you that you need something, or how much is this? How much are the outlets and growers looking at this to try and find out what they need rather than just being flogged something?
Yeah, so I mean, it's the same issue. You know, they'll have the vast majority of ornamental growers and horticultural growers, they will get their nutrient management information from the people selling them the fertilizers. So this is why, another reason why they do so much monitoring is because they know what the target sort of electrical conductivity should be and roughly the sort of levels they should be having in their crop. And if it's too high, then they know that they're being flogged something they don't need. So yeah, there is pressure from that. You know, we do have basis qualified advisors as well. So I mean, like, I'm a FACTS qualified advisor and I'm not affiliated with any fertilizer company. So there are people out there who they can talk to who will not try to flog them something.
That's great, thanks.
Okay, let's
Georgie, I mean, so many questions. You know, I mean, the hort world is just, you know, taking it down the regen ag world without a doubt. But the substrate you grow in, so there's a couple of things. The flush you talk about, is that, could you expand a little bit more on that? How often is that done and what is it?
Okay, so if you are in a controlled environment, or if you're just in pots, obviously it's much easier to do than in soil, and it's basically you just flush it through with water. So this EC meter at the top, the blue meter this guy's holding, there's sort of a target range that you'll be aiming for with your crop, and if it goes too high, you can initially reduce how much fertilizer you're using in your feed, but then if that still is too high, it means there's a build-up and you need to flush the whole system out with water, and basically start again. And I would say that, you know, most growers don't have to do this on a particularly frequent basis. It might be once or twice a year, or if it suddenly gets a spike in temperature in the weather. But if you're not a particularly good grower, then it's something that you'd have to do far more regularly. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm guessing, you know, most people could, in the question, we should have this poll I don't think there'll be an issue with doing a flush through this year. It'll have already happened. So
yeah,
we've got an even playing field. Now, the substrate you're using, where are you with that? The percentage OM and organic matter levels in that? Is there a key? Is there a base? Or what do you need for this to kick off? Or
so I mean, most people have sort of, this last generation of growers have used peat, and everyone has used peat up until recently. And of course, now we're having to reduce how much peat we use to hit carbon emission targets in the UK. So people are using things like coir, which is coconut fibre. People are using wood fibre, green compost, perlite, vermiculite. Like there's hundreds of different products they can use. And there are several big companies who produce the substrate on a large scale, but growers will be tinkering with their particular substrate that they use all the time. Some people make their own, but most people buy them sort of off the shelf from these big commercial producers. So they don't really talk about organic matter in the same way as people growing in soil, but what they do talk about is air-filled porosity. So it's a lot about structure. You know, will it slump? Will it hold water well? But will it drain well? It's those sort of more structural elements that are more important in container growing.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about the EC, is it the same for all plants? Is there like an equivalent for cereals? Do you think? Or, you know, it's obviously your remit, but
I think it's about establishing a baseline. You know, if you've got a healthy crop and a relatively consistent crop in terms of quality, you know, use that as your baseline for your electrical conductivity in the soil. And then if it starts to go haywire, you know that something's changed, or you know the weather has had an effect, or I don't know, your spreader's not spreading as consistent. You know, you can identify patches within your field and things like that. So yeah, you will need. I will stress this later on as well, but you will need to have that year where you figure out your baseline, and then you can start to see variations over the years.
Yeah, as you test the crops, yeah. And the EC side of it, I mean, this is all based on the soil before you get the plant in and actually get it going. So this is just getting the soil right.
Well, yeah, it's getting the soil right, but so the guy at the top there is a nursery just outside Stratford, and he'll be doing those meter readings once a day, maybe 2 to 3 times a day, depending on which glass house he's in. And you know, he has an old glass house which is not as consistent in its temperature and water delivery, so he'll measure more frequently in that one, and then in the newer one he knows that he doesn't have to look at it for a couple of days. So it really helps you to sort of fine-tune and respond to sort of, you know, quirks at your site as well. So yeah, no, they'll be constantly monitoring.
Yeah, we'll not go too far into the other meters, so I know you've a fair bit to come yet, so I'll let you carry on with that. Thank you.
Okay, so this is just to give you an idea of so this is a stock solution. So in those 2 tubs they will have 2 different types of fertilizer, and then above it you can see the tube. There is an injector pump, and that's what pumps it into the irrigation system. And there's a lot of growers who are like that. You know, it's a pretty basic setup, and what they do is they'll use that EC meter reading in that stock solution before it gets to the plant. But so yeah, that's what they use. And then some growers are pushing the boundaries with technology. So this basically does the same thing as the picture on the left, but you have automatic equipment measuring the electrical conductivity, the pH, the temperature, the nutrient solution, and it'll be doing it every pulse that goes into the water. So every time a bit of fertilizer is released, that sort of white box there that you can see will be measuring how much is going into the system and measuring the concentration. So it's entirely automated, and the grower doesn't have to do anything. So that's the sort of level that some growers are operating at. Just moving on to a bit of water and PGRs. So I'm sure you all recognise these. These are poinsettias. You buy them at Christmas. They are the bane of my life. I hate them. I've seen far too many. The UK produces about 8 million a year, and we import about another 4 million. So they're a very popular Christmas product, and they take about 6 months to make, and most growers never ever want to see them ever again. But they bring in a good money basically. So each one of those pots will sell for about £3 a pot. So it's a high value crop. They have very strict specifications, so they have to be 30 centimeters high. Those red parts of the plants, they're not leaves, they're bracts, so that's part of the flower. They have to have a particular number of red bracts, and they have to have a particular type of branching and all this sort of stuff. Incredibly difficult to keep that consistency. So most growers will spray them with 3 sprays of plant growth regulators to try and hit those customer specifications, and the supermarkets are super fussy. So they've been relying on these chemicals for a long time, and of course these things eat so much water, they just soak it up the whole time. So what has happened is that they've now got less options in terms of using plant growth regulators, PGRs, and we're losing them all the time. So there's basically not the option to use them anymore. So we've been doing a lot of work over the last 10 years, and this last couple of years we've really scaled it up. So on the left is the normal crop, and on the right is a crop which has received no plant growth regulators whatsoever and has been entirely controlled by reducing the amount of water. So I appreciate this is a very controlled environment, which is not the case for a field full of cereals, but I think the point is that this is monitored incredibly closely, and they were very nervous about not watering very much. But because they've monitored so closely, they've been able to spot problems and deal with them before they become an issue. So if you have a really dry year with your crop, if you're monitoring it closely, you can probably get away with a bit more drought than you think you can, but you've really got to be on it. And the crop on the right, producing exactly the same way as the crop on the left, apart from the PGRs and the water. It has a better shelf life, it has better consistency, and it's selling for exactly the same amount as the one on the left, but with reduced inputs, so they're making cost saving. Finally, I just want to run through a bit of handheld equipment that we've tested and is being used in the horticultural world. So you've heard Chris talk about Brix meters. Brix meters measure the translucence of sap and can give you an idea of how much sugar is in that sap. And so we use that in fruit, and it gives an indication of how sweet that fruit is, so it's a measure of quality. And there are so many different types of equipment out there. The ones I'm going to show you now are just the ones that we found worked best in our trials and are the easiest to use as well. So this first one is called an at-leaf. It's a spad meter, and if you look to the left-hand side of it, it's clamped over a leaf, and it basically measures the amount of chlorophyll that's in that leaf, and that's an indicator of nitrogen content. And that can be used on any crop. And what you do is you pre-program it to put either the name of the crop or the name of the field or the name of the trial that you're doing. And when you take a reading, it will record it with that name, and then you can download it onto your computer afterwards and keep a record of how much chlorophyll is in that plant. And if you use marker plants, you can keep going back to them throughout the year to keep an eye on the chlorophyll content. The next one is an app that works with an iPhone. It's called the Green Index app, and it basically you hold this board that comes with the app in front of the camera, and you put a leaf across the pink part, and it basically measures the greenness of the leaf, again giving an indication of nitrogen content. And every time you take a picture, it emails it to you and downloads it to an Excel file. This has actually proved to be really, really easy to use, and generally gives quite a good indication of nitrogen content. And the app is relatively new, so we're not super duper high tech in Hort. We are learning all the time, and this was one of the workshops that we had to let growers get their hands on it and actually have a go and see what they liked. And the idea is just to present them with a range of options, and then they can decide how much they want to spend, what would suit their setup the most, and they can take it from there. Finally, this is a ProCheck GS3 probe. You can set it to either look at soil or substrate, so it's perfectly usable in the field. and it measures electrical conductivity, pH and temperature, as well as giving an indication of sort of nutrient levels. This you can just type things in the field and it will automatically send it back, and it's really easy to use. The most exciting thing about this one is when we were trialing it, we found that it could pick up nutritional differences in the plant before you could see anything with the naked eye. So we think it's giving you about a 2-week head start on any nutritional problems that might be coming down the line, so you can correct it before it becomes an issue and causes problems in your crop. And I think that would also be really useful, because you guys are quite, you've got to be really careful about your protein content, don't you, in cereals. So yeah, if you can sort things out before you start seeing problems with the naked eye, then that's a bonus. All of these things are instant, so if you're in the field using them, the @leaf on the left, you have to go back and download it. The iPhone, if you're using it in the field, it will send it an email to you back at the office, and the ProCheck probe will also send things back to the office, and it's all automatically downloaded. This is my last. Yeah, go on.
A question for you. That one, the one on the right, ProCheck. What nutrients? I mean, can that measure everything, or is it fairly limited spectrum of what it can measure?
It's a limited spectrum, so it's not going to measure the micronutrients. And with all of these things, you have to calibrate it. But yeah, the NPK, it will measure.
And when it's picking them up, you know, I mean, you guys will generally be foliar nutrition. Have you moved most?
No, not always. No. I mean, we do have foliar sprays for some crops, but we also use liquid feeding. We use controlled release fertilizers. So that's like the prills that you guys would also use in the field. It's a mixture, and it's people finding what works for them in their particular crop at their particular site. And I think that's the thing with these pieces of equipment, is you've got to do that year of baselining to figure out what the changes are across your site across a year, and then you can predict what's going to happen in following years. But that initial year, you need to use these things together with physical samples like leaf samples and soil samples, and you marry them up, and you can see what the probe or the SPAD meter or the @leaf is telling you, and how it relates to what you're seeing in lab analyses. And what that means is that you get that much quicker feedback instead of waiting a few days or a couple of weeks for any lab results to come back.
Yeah, very interesting question. Just you know, I was going to go down the Brix one, but how much of nutrient availability is due to the amount of soil available nutrition? You mentioned small pot plants that you buy from shops and their short nutrient availability. Could arable growers reduce the amount of inputs if they maximise their rooting? Oof, yeah, quite a question.
Repeat that last bit again. Could
really? Could arable growers reduce the amount of inputs if they maximise their rooting?
Well, yes, I would say that is true. But it's also about pH of the soil, which will affect the availability of the nutrients.
So, you know, and in the press, I mean, we always read calcium's absolutely key. You know, and it always, how do you get your calcium, whether it's in lime, whether it's applied, it's always a difficult one, and it doesn't mix with anything, does it? It's a disaster. No. But we've played a little bit with this with David and our Fife business group between the Brix meter, and we've only really got as far as the Brix meter and leaf samples in the Yen group, and the fantastic the work that Yen does. Once you get past, you know, not everyone's going for yield. That's not what it's about. It's just about monitoring what you've got on farm. And I was going to ask, so sometimes the curve we've got out the Brix meter, you know, we can watch it and we can keep it from 12 to 15 on the Brix, no bother at all. But there comes a point where you just get that feeling that you want to put on nitrogen. But are you guys resisting that, or how are you? You know, are you only feeding as you go? Because as soon as we apply nitrogen, you know, the Brix will fall through 6 or 7 easily.
Yeah. It depends on the grower. It's a really hard one. You know, you get these growers who will stick to what they know and they won't deviate from what they've always done. This is, you know, using these, you're trusting little pieces of technology which are still relatively new, and I think that's quite hard. So someone made a collection of all the conversations that we were having with growers throughout some of these trials, and the most frequent phrase that was said was, "I'm getting very nervous about this now," because we were saying, no, don't put it on yet, don't put it on yet, don't water yet, don't add nitrogen yet, and we really pushed them to their limits. So it takes a little bit of time to trust what the piece of technology is telling you, and that's why you've got to marry it up with those physical samples initially, so that you're not missing a trick. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does, because you can instantly go into detail on this, and what's actually measured in the soil, but it's the trend, isn't it, really, that you're after?
Trend, absolutely. You're bang on. Like
trend.
The trend, yeah. You're looking at the trends, and the trend is what is important. A little dip here and there. If it's a big dip, sure, take notice. But yeah, you want that overall trend throughout your cropping season.
Yeah. And are you guys seeing this? So if you manage the crop nutrition on the way in, does that translate? Because obviously these ornamentals and hort plants, they will get disease as normal.
Yeah.
So are you seeing a reduction in disease if you manage the nutrition better?
Yeah. So if you have a healthy plant, a more robust plant, then they're suffering less of disease. You get less wastage of crop and less discards of like product. So most of these guys will have, I don't know, something like 10% that they might throw away each year because it doesn't quite meet the specification, or it's diseased, or or whatever. And yeah, using these things to monitor more closely, they are reducing how much is wasted, and it's improving year on year.
Yeah, and do you think, sorry, Rob, do you think you see the correlation when the disease comes in and you start to get that wastage? Is the trend there on these analysis in terms of EC and whatnot?
We haven't tested that specifically where we've married up one of these nutritional sort of pieces of equipment and disease, but in the field, you hear these sort of anecdotal things where they've found that there's less disease incidence when there's healthier crops, and not overfeeding. Overfeeding seems to make things much softer and fare worse when it comes to disease, particularly. And aphids just love a juicy plump leaf. So if you're overfeeding your crop, then yeah, you do get more problems.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So you would see that correlation between over nutrition to insect problems as well?
Yes. As far as I know, this is the insect and disease stuff is not my forte. So I'm going to be very politician-like and say
tomorrow's webinar. We can push that down. Yeah. So they'll cover that tomorrow. No pressure, Teresa. Yeah.
Georgie, do you think you mentioned these guys are monitoring more than once in a day, a few times every single day?
Yeah.
Obviously, we can't on an arable unit, we can't do it that frequently. Do you think they're still usable on a like once a day or once every other day or weekly basis through the growing season? And maybe, I know you guys have done a bit of this north of the border. How often have you been using your Brix meters, and what have you been doing with that? So Georgie first.
So what we did with these trials is, so the handheld EC meter is what's being used sort of frequently and more than once a day. These were just used every 3 weeks, 4 weeks, or at particular growth stages. So I think, am I right in thinking in cereals you have T1, T2, all the way up the different growth stages? So what you could do is you could, at key growth stages, do your monitoring. So yeah, no, you don't have to do it every day. My God, no. That's incredibly inefficient in terms of labour, and because nutrient status changes more slowly in the soil, I don't think you would have to monitor it quite as much. So yeah, pick key times during the year, whether that's growth stages, key times for you, problem times where you see things emerge, and start building up your picture from there. But no, no, you wouldn't have to do it every day.
Yeah, perfect. David, so you've a bit of background on the Brix meters testing that you've done a bit longer than I have. It was my background was just a 20 quid Amazon purchase, and off we go. And David's got a slightly more expensive one, or had. Maybe we run it over by now, but
yes, nearly. It's a discipline, and that's the bit that I've struggled with the most, is that I kind of settled on once a week, because if you're walking your crops, you just have to make a point of getting to roughly the same bit in the same field once a week at the same time of day, of course, for Brix, because of course if the sun's lower or higher, it can have an impact. But and that's difficult. If you're walking crop in the kind of standard fashion, it doesn't really matter what time of day you can see it or what day of the week. You can just, if you're driving past, you can just sniff in, yep, what's it look like, what's the disease like, make an assessment and move on. Whereas getting this timeliness about it is the struggle, particularly for me. But I can practice on that, I think.
Yeah, and it does take time to sort of form that habit. I'm just aware of time, so I'll just go on to my last slide, if that's okay. I just wanted to leave you with some sort of tips that have come out of what horticultural growers have found. So as I've said before, when you're using these sort of pieces of equipment, marry them up to those physical samples, at least in the first year, to make sure you've got an accurate picture. Use selected marker crops. So by that I mean pick an area or several areas within your field and revisit those throughout the year when you're monitoring. And select sample timings or to reflect stages of plant growth. And what might help with the consistency is dedicating one person to doing it. So in horticulture, you can swing from having 10 people to 250 people working on your site. And I understand in arable it's not quite the same as that. And even if you only have 3 people in your business, if you just say, okay, well, it's your responsibility to do this on a regular basis, then at least the same person is measuring it in the same way. Even if it's not that frequent, it's much better to have that one person doing it. And if everyone in the business has to be on board with what you're trying to achieve. With the poinsettias, those red plants, they were having real problems in that the guys who came in to water in the mornings, in the weekdays, had a different habit of watering than the guys who came in at the weekend to do the watering. And so you've got to make sure you're having that conversation with everybody who's managing the crop to make sure everyone's on board with those lower inputs. And lastly, specification is really, really important in horticultural crops, as is with millers, I'm sure. And it's good to bring them into the conversation and have that conversation about what is actually achievable. I'll leave it there unless anyone has any other questions.
Well, thanks very much, George. I mean, there's a lot of questions coming in there. So with the questions, what we'll do, we can print them out onto a document, and we'll ping them onto the relevant speaker, and they'll be posted back on with the video as well. And I'm trying to get through as many of them as I can, as well as my own questions for it. But thanks very much, Georgina. When we first heard,
happy to answer any questions after the webinar as well. So.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much. And it shows again, the horticulture guys are miles in front of us, and there is loads to be learned from what you guys are doing. I mean, all the good stuff that Graham Sate and John Kempf does, all kicks off with the intensive crops in the veg world, and it can all be transposed all the way back down the line, and some interesting discussion topics there as well. We've got a quick poll now that Christian's going to run just to see where we are with that, because I know we've a bit coming on to it. So do you use any crop disease monitoring to go with your IPM strategy? So the poll's open, and remember you need to click the little double screen thing to allow you to click on screen as well. So really interesting stuff there from Georgia, as we were saying. As I was saying, a Brix meter on Amazon, I think was about £20, and you go out and get a reading. We've been following it all season, and like I say, anytime you apply nitrogen or a fungicide, it drops as a correlation we get, and you can deduce that. I know Fiona will be kicking me under the desk in a minute, but you've got to deduce from that what you do. So here are results in. So 31% are yes, disease monitoring in there, good, and 69% no. So hopefully, if there is a takeaway from this as part of the IPM strategy, you guys could potentially look at some form of disease monitoring. So we'll have a quick flick through, obviously just conscious of time. We'll get kicked on to David there, and he'll run us through a few of the things that's going on at Bulburney for the season ahead. This is obviously our first year with a strategic farm up at Bulburney, so we've a few trials which David will go through as well, hopefully.
Sorry about that, everybody. I had a bit of bother with my my mute button wouldn't work for some reason. Well, interesting the poll, seeing that there's some monitoring going on, but a lot of it haven't been so much. And I would add to that after Georgina's interesting talk that I don't think we've been monitoring anything like enough, even though we've been trying ourselves. I've only got a couple of slides to show really. If Christian could move on to the next slide, please. This is a field that was wheat in 2019, and you can see the obvious anomaly within the field is the tram line where we used no fungicides or PGRs at all season. The variety was Istabrac. It suffered very badly in the dry spring that year. It's quite a sandy field that we can grow carrots on there, and the rest of the field just had a standard program T1, T2, T3, and we applied just trace elements a lot of the time to this strip, and trying to see if we could prove or disprove one way or another the theory of being able to maintain or keep a crop healthy without the use of fungicides. Throughout the growing season, it was fascinating because the Brix was notably higher on that one tram line every time you went into the field. It would be 4, 5, 6 points higher than the crop surrounding it that had been treated with the synthetic products. We didn't really do any tissue sampling as such that year. It was a very ad hoc basis, just to see what would happen. And as you can see, the average yield for that area was about a ton a hectare less. So over the piece, we were down financially on that particular field. We had 2 or 3 other fields that we tried. One field of Leeds, which we did the same process, but we had to give up at T2 because the yellow rust just came in and took it out. So clearly too dirty a variety, which indeed we don't grow anymore, for this to work. And we also had some skyscraper in another field, which was more interesting. And there was one, I don't think a huge difference between the two. The only reason I haven't got a yield map up there is because it was cut with 2 combines, one being a demonstrator, and I haven't quite worked out how to get the 2 yield maps to work together. But it showed more promise. And so the picture is the field as of yesterday, sown direct drilled into wheat variety Istabrac again for next year, and we'll give it another shot. But I think it demonstrated that there's maybe a bit of mileage in this over the 3 fields we've tried it in, and if we try harder and do a bit more monitoring, we can go further. So next slide, please, Christian. So really, as part of one of the trials that we're doing starting next year to do the strategic farm here at Bulburney, is we're going to be using the Brix, monitoring the condition of the crop using Brix, and if the level drops down below a level that we haven't determined yet, probably 12 or 10 potentially, we will then initiate a tissue sample to see what's causing that, and see if we can get this crop through with little or no financial penalty as a result. It's interesting hearing Georgina commenting about how the Germans are doing this in the horticultural world. Certainly, it would seem they're 2 weeks ahead, so they're doing testing more regularly, so they're able to keep the nutrition where it ought to be. Whereas with the Brix, I suppose we're reacting to the situation, which is perhaps one downside to the system, maybe. So yeah, that's really all I've got to say just now about this topic.
Have you any idea off the top of your head where you are organic matter levels Bulburney wise? I mean, the Hochland will be a bit better, obviously, but are you roughly still about 3 under?
We're more, yeah, there'll be one or two lower bits, but we've tested ground at 4 to 6, or some fields at more than that. Disappointingly, though, we had one very sandy field that we tested at 4%, which we thought was pretty good for the type of soil it was. So we thought, well, let's go and walk and look in the fence line where, you know, it's not been cultivated or had anything done to it for, you know, forever and a day, thinking we'd get a really big result from that, and it would try and demonstrate that what we could build the soil to, and it was 4% as well. So we were a bit disappointed at that. Lots more worms, but no more organic matter, it would be.
Yeah, it's an interesting, you know, it does open your mind up completely, doesn't it? You know, I mean, there's loads of stats out there saying that, you know, 70% of all arable land is now less than 3% organic matter, and you think, well, you know, that's a difficult place to come back to. You know, when New Zealand are up there 10s, 11%, you know, not seeing the disease levels that we do because of that. So the starting point is very difficult to get. But I mean, are you hoping to influence that the organic matter? Is that part of the key, or are you thinking it's the nutrition levels of the soil, or what's your sort of goal with that?
I think organic matter is the driver behind most of what we do with our soils. We have hungrier fields across the place, and we haven't tested them, but my suspicion is that they will be lower in organic matter. The soils are generally harder to deal with. They deal with the rain. They don't cope with the rain quite so well, and I suspect that that's a big part behind it. We've moved to direct drilling as much as we can, albeit we still have vegetables and root crops in the rotation, which we're trying to work out how to do that differently. But that's the difficult and very challenging. That's a subject in its own right, and we are seeing benefits. There seem to be a lot of studies done that prove that whether you plough the field or don't plough the field, the organic matter, it's just where the organic matter sits in the soil profile seems to be the difference, and you don't necessarily build it any quicker whether you plough the field for cultivation or don't plough it. My thought on that would be that actually by keeping the organic matter near the surface and near where there's more oxygen and things, we're keeping the biology going, which is in turn is cycling the nutrients and should lead to healthier plants.
Yeah, exactly. So the soil health is key. The photosynthesis, you know, green area, keeping stuff in. Actually, the cultivation is such a quick thing that, yes, okay, direct drilling is one answer, but you know, to plough is fine. But keeping the photosynthesis going in the soil is the key to grow organic matter, really. And yeah, then
we're cover cropping as much as we can, just down to logistics, the bits that we can't get done. There's only so much you can do in a year, but we're trying to keep green growing all year round on as much of the farm as we can, and using livestock to recycle that background to get the nutrients back, and doing more testing. We can perhaps find out how much nutrients we can recycle around, and again, that should help us reduce our inputs and save some money.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking back to your trial down on the lowlands there, next to Bulgoni. When you were doing that, the Brix, although you had a high Brix, the margin didn't come out in the end. But I'm just thinking back, obviously we've been working quite closely here, but at that stage you probably didn't have the products lined up to keep the Brix up. Would that be fair? Or why did you think? Yeah, why did the margin? How did that end? It was pretty cold turkey to leave the tramline all season once we'd run out of products or knowledge to throw at it. Really, is where I'm coming from.
Well, when I say we did it on an ad hoc basis, we found effectively a multivitamin for plants that anyone can buy from the local distributor, and it looked good. It looked like it had a good mix of trace elements, etc. in it. And every time the sprayer went through and did the T1, T2, and T3 with the fungicide, etc., and the rest of the field, once we'd done that, or beforehand, we just put this in the tank and just do it with this product that anyone can get hold of. So there's very little science behind it. The fact that there was a yield reduction, the crop looked worse than the yield reduction showed, actually. For all it looked dramatic on the yield map, when you actually looked on the ground, you thought, yeah, this crop's going to produce a lot less than that. And that may have just been variety. I say other variety was was better. And I think with a bit of science behind it and a bit of measuring behind it, I think we can close the gap quite dramatically. And it wasn't a particularly clean year that year either. Yes, we had a dry spell in the spring, but it was a grubby year later on. Time the flag leaves are out, it started getting pretty filthy on the crops. And with spring barley, we've managed to get to produce with little difference at all, using just nutrition and not bothering with any fungicides at all. We seem to have almost cracked that one, I think. And again, with spring oats too, they seem to be too responsive to fungicides. And some of our better crops this harvest had no fungicide at all, and little science. So if we can add the science in, then maybe we can really make some inroads into it.
Exactly. Now, I think that's the key objective of the strategic farm with us, is to actually draw some conclusions to some of the work that's been going on there. Because we've got all the questions, but none of the answers. And hearing from Georgie tonight about how quickly we can get this data. Instead of waiting for plant tests, likes of in the end stuff, which is great and very valuable, but we want to react quicker to see if we can move it on a little bit and just see how we can get on. So, yeah, thanks very much for that, David. We'll just move on now. We've got Brian up next to run us through some of the trials that he's been doing down on his farm.
Yep, evening. Hi, everyone. Firstly, I'd just like to apologise to all the pros out there, because I'm sure there's plenty of other people who are doing a lot less than what we actually are going to be talking about tonight. But we're really just scratching the surface. And obviously, I've been involved with the Strategic Farm for sort of 3 years. And through the Modern Farm Programme, we've done a few things about reducing sort of nutrition and fungicides and things like that. But we've sort of last couple of years concentrated on fungicides. So if we can move the slides on. We should bring up the map of the 2019 trial that we did through the Strategic Farm. So we sort of had a low input, medium input and a high input through the sprayer, mainly looking at fungicides and nutrition, trace elements mainly, and PGR. So anything through the sprayer was included in these different treatments. The main fertilizer was kept standard throughout. And this is where the big question comes on. When we look at fungicides, it's quite easy to start lowering inputs, because it's a pretty instant thing that you can see lots of disease and leaf disappear, whereas nutrition, I think, is the bigger question that we need to be talking about. When you look at the Farmbench costs, fertilizer costs are pretty much double the fungicide. So this is where we need to start really looking at how we sort of change our sort of approach to nutrition when we start talking about lowering inputs. And when we look at net zero, nitrogen fertilizer, carbon calculator shows you that nitrogen is the real biggie that we've got to really look at delving into in a lot more science. So this is where the sort of conversations with the horticultural team and different things that other people are doing on farms is going to be key. So this trial was just a quick run through. So I'll just show you a couple of the varieties, what they looked like in 2019 when we had some nice crops to look at compared to last year. So we move on to, I think the first one is moving on slide wise. Yep. So Graham, so this is what they look like, a nice thick crop compared to what we had last year. And you can see the untreated, this was taken just after T3. There was a visible change in sort of green area leaf, and hopefully that would sort of transfer into yield. And then if we look at a sort of more susceptible variety, Graham's obviously quite a robust variety. If we move on to Santiago, hopefully that will show a bit of a difference. So if we move on to the next slide. Yep, so you can see obviously Santiago, a bit more dirty, a bit more disease. 2019 for us was again pretty low disease year until very late on when we got yellow rust came flooding through. So you can see that the high investment actually bought us quite a lot of green leaf in the susceptible variety. So when we looked at the results when the plot combine had been in and done its business, we can see the cost of productions and yields in the next slide. So yeah, so these are the sort of yield awards. So you can see that Santiago, the untreated, basically fell off a cliff, but you actually bought quite a lot of response with the high investment. And others from memory, I think you can go back to all these handouts on our sort of website, on the AHDB website. So the more detail, if you want to look at this, you can go back to that. But you can see that Graham was, and the more robust disease package actually held up in the untreated, but it also delivered in the high as well. And so you start sort of questioning if we were actually getting pound yield from our actual investment. So when you look at the cost of production from this season's demonstration in the next slide, it shows that really the best cost of production pound per ton, when you have all of the cost of extra sprayer runs, extra products being applied, actually in the last sort of, I would say, in 2019, and when we look at 2020, 2020 results aren't really as clean as what we've got because of the establishment problems that we had in our trial last year. But this really highlighted to me that we could actually rein back, and the low investment is something to persevere with. We've done a lot of testing, we've done a lot of dry matter tissue analysis over the years, and we sort of concentrate on our sort of the micronutrition, looking at copper, zinc and boron as the key players when it comes to disease. But we've also had responses through planting with wider rows. We've definitely seen, since we moved to strip tillage and direct drilling on wider rows, we've actually seen a real dramatic drop in septoria. Okay, we haven't had really septoria years, but we've been doing this for that establishment for now 6 years, and our septoria disease is much lower on a wide row spacing. So that's a different way of looking at it. And then the whole element of biologicals comes into it as well, and this is something that hopefully the Strategic Farm program, now we've got Rob and David and hopefully another one joining us soon, that we can start really delving into these bigger questions of nutrition with septoria, with biologicals, and nutrition leading to it. And we know that from all the podcasts and things you hear, that the N level, when we flood it with too much nitrogen, it actually breeds more disease. So that's something that sort of really rings in my ears, and not to sort of forget this going forward. So last year I had a bit of a challenge to myself, and we went for a field and did a field scale, how low I could go. And so if we move on to the next slide, it'll be, this was done last year. And so every time I went into that field, I was going, do I need to do it? Do I really need to do it? It's not an insurance. I'm just going to go as low as I possibly could. So we took a second year field of winter wheat, siskin, untreated seed, drilled behind the plough in late October, and put on a pre-emergent herbicide for blackgrass. And then in the spring, it was no T0, didn't see any disease. We just put some copper and zinc on, and that was it for T0 with a bit of PGR. Then at T1, just half a litre of TEB. T2, it was dry, low disease year. It was looking quite dry at the time, so I wasn't worried about an explosion of sort of big biomass, sort of green material coming through and breeding a lot of disease. And so we sort of held back on the nitrogen, so we only applied 150 kilos, and that was a really key decision for me. And when we're trying to lower inputs, how low I could pull that figure back, and I reckon I went probably too high, and I could have reined it back a bit further. And then very late on in the season, around T3, you could start seeing a bit of yellow rust coming in. So then we just put on another half litre of TEB, and that was 12 quid's worth of fungicide. And it really showed. And when the combine went in to sort of combine it, I was quite hopeful. It was the field right behind my house, so I looked at it every single day, and every time I opened the curtains I was looking at it. And so it was a bit of a brave decision to do it, but it was also right behind the village, so it meant less sprayer runs and fertilizer runs, so it was sort of keeping the PR for the industry up a little bit. But you can see that the yield, 9.4 tons, was probably second on our sort of highest yielding field of last year's harvest. And the actual cost of production per ton is probably going to be the best across the farm last year. So it really highlighted to me the potential of lowering it, but it's very risky at that same time. It's a challenging mindset over it and having very open and honest discussions with my agronomist. So it all comes down to risk, and I've said that many times. It's your own personal attitude to risk, and I wouldn't want to have my whole farm in that scenario, but we've got the capability to travel quickly with fungicides if we see a disease coming in. So be brave is what I would say.
Yeah, fantastic, Brian. I mean, thank you for doing all that work as well. With the costings and figures, it really does highlight it there. I mean, where do you think, from having pulled that back, like your N application there? So, how did you split that up, and at what point did you sort of start to think, is there a correlation between putting nitrogen on and then starting to panic, or was it sort of slightly different there?
To be honest, I've had a few gin and tonics since then, so and a very wet autumn to compare with, and I've lost a bit of hair because of another wet one. But I would say the nitrogen decision was the biggest, and I'm a big advocate for tiller counts, shoot counts, plant counts, and I've got use the growth guide to sort of try and predict yield. And so I based my 150 kilos of N on the plant structure that I saw in the field. And so I thought that was going to do about 8.5 ton. And so then I based my nitrogen to that from memory. And that's how the sort of the way I've been doing it for the last few years. So, but I reckon I could have pulled that down lower. And I think as my soil and my understanding and my sort of brave sort of voice on that shoulder saying go less in the right circumstances, that's where it comes down to that. You really got to, and all these testers and things like the chlorophyll testers that you can see on the market, they're all there. The NDVI, we've got scanners of NDVI, so I can start being a little bit more sensitive to PGRs, to nitrogen and everything else. So it's really about that attention to detail, and I think that's where lowering inputs comes. Like, you got to be brave, and you need to use technology and a good advice to be open and honest and say, do we need to be doing this? And there's some people out there, there's some great people. Obviously, lowering inputs part 1 back in whenever it was first lockdown was a great discussion. There's different ways to do it, and I want to get to where sort of Simon and Tim were in that discussion, but at the same time it's breaking that sort of routine. And this year on our strategic farm, we've got another trial going in. We've broken the 5 variety trial up, and so now we've got a high and low inputs going on, sort of a split field tramline trial, but then we're only applying T1 to certain areas, to certain plots, T2 to certain plots, T3, and then doing all the range of Ts so then we can see where the actual payback of fungicide treatments came. Was it in T1? Could we have just got away with just doing a T3? And I reckon last year we could have got away with just doing T3. So, and then hopefully next year dabble into a bit of biologicals, and then sort of look at how nutrition is going to be the key to sort of driving down sort of carbon sort of calculator figures and meeting the challenge of net zero, which I think is something that we've all got to sort of man up to.
Yeah, absolutely, Brian. That'll be the next webinar. That could be part 3, and yeah, we'll keep listening to the questions and see where we want to go next with this. Look, thanks very much for that. Obviously conscious of time here, and we'll move on to Rob, and then yeah, we'll sum up at the end. So thanks very much for that, and great to hear you doing these trials. So we'll bring in Rob.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, thank you. We did a similar thing to Brian, nowhere near in as much level of detail as he did over in the east. If we can move on to the first slide, Christian. We did just a split field on a single variety. Again, it was Graham trying to make use of the high resistance within the variety in the first place. We were nowhere near as brave as Brian. We did a low input, not a how low can we go, or let's be very, very brave. But we essentially put a low input which was really low fungicide. Tried to keep the nitrogen the same across the field, so we weren't varying too many things at the same time. So the farm standard is a 4-spray program, as it would be on most farms. The low input, we dropped out a initial fungicide, and we dropped out a E3, just left it with the other 2 fungicides. We noticed a lot of rust coming in at T1, so they were identical across both halves of the field. But I think if we were braver, and if we were reacting, what I've learned a little bit since then, and speaking to the guys as well the last few days on the other strategic farms, is, you know, is there a certain level of disease which we don't worry about too much? You notice yellow rust in these crops, and we run out and think, oh God, we've got to go out and spray this, and we do, and that's what we did. We reacted, and we hit it hard with quite a robust spray at that particular time. But is there a level of disease which we should be kind of okay with, not be reacting too quickly? And that's what I want to try and learn. What I want to try and learn this year. This was back in 2019, sorry, harvest, and we didn't manage to get the trial in the ground last year, so we didn't manage to run this through again 2020. We are going to have it in the ground again now. Thankfully, we managed to get the crop drilled, so there'll be another trial in there. It actually happens to be the same field again. This time we're trying a second variety, so X-Days and Siskin. We're going to be running a farm standard program, hopefully a braver, maybe Strategic Farm East recommended fungicide on some other plots, and then we're going to do hopefully do a no fungicide biological spray program, and see if we can reduce inputs and reduce fungicides again that way. The bottom line of this slide is the cost of production. Very, very little between it per ton per hectare. Above, we're saving sort of, what's that, 35, 38, 39 quid. Excuse my maths. A little bit of difference in yield, nothing statistically viable. So yes, the farm standard had a slightly higher yield, but it was that close. We can't really take that much out of it. So hopefully, potentially, there is room there to reduce fungicides. Can we move on to the next slide, please, Christian? I just wanted to throw this up there. We've been involved in various fungicide challenges, as a lot of people have around the UK over the years. Really thing to note there is the right-hand side, the spend over all 4 sprays. Generally, people are becoming braver in these trials, in these fungicide challenges, and looking at different ways of doing it, reducing spend, and you can see over the years the average spend within these programs is starting to come down. Now, this is on small trial plots within a field, and usually the case is people aren't doing this program on the rest of their farm. They're being a bit braver with this and seeing what they can do. But the spend is slowly coming down. And in terms of return on investment, if we just go on to the next slide, which I think is my last one anyway. Please, Christian. Yeah, so margin over fungicide, return on investment on your fungicide. Now this is what it sort of boils down to, and we're talking about managed lower inputs and reacting to the season. On the right hand side there, you can see the margin over fungicide. And in some years, there's been a hell of a lot of bang for your buck, and in other years, very, very little. Obviously, different varieties, a few of those earlier varieties, 2011, 12, and 13, you know, Duxford, Oakley, Santiago, renowned well, particularly Santiago, renowned for being rusty. So managed, you know, what we're talking about here is managing inputs lower, not doing it for the sake of it, reacting to the season, reacting to variety, reacting to your market, not being nudged into doing something we don't necessarily need to do, but also making more informed decisions on what we can get away with and where we can reduce things. So
absolutely. I was just going to say there, Rob, I mean, that, you know, powerful figures you put forward, and thank you very much for doing them. And it does highlight at the start, I was just saying, you know, Mark at the start was saying that actually the price of fungicides has increased. So actually, of course, the margin here has to have decreased because the actual cost of the product. So it's not the response to fungicide, it's the cost, which is exactly what we're seeing there. You know, the same, like you say, the Santiago, Oakley, Leeds to us was horrific in Scotland. Lily was okay. Graham, not the best up here either. But you know, some of these ones, it's the cost of the fungicide that's now doing it, isn't it? And that's maybe what's driving us towards lowering the inputs and looking at alternative ways of doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, the varieties have got a huge part in this now. Obviously, you're going to get much more back on really dirty varieties. But is there a way, you know, of using some of these more modern varieties, higher resistance levels?
Yeah, you know, return on investment, especially, isn't it? You know, if you're up the 150, 200 pounds a hectare, it's starting to get a fairly significant cost and part of the farm budget. So
yeah, absolutely. And our options are being reduced more and more on what we can use, what's available. So making more informed decisions, you know, managing, you know, and that's the really important word, managing these inputs, whether it be taking levels through handheld meters, through satellite images, through tractor mounted, you know, machines and scanners. You know, it's just about making more informed decisions and reacting at the right time. I don't think we're ever going to get as reactive as maybe the horticultural industry are, but maybe that's what we've got to aspire to.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much for that, Rob. Yeah, fantastic discussion. So I think we've just a couple of slides left. So we've got questions there, and as I say, any questions you do put in there for them, if we don't manage to pick them up, which Fiona's trying hard, we will do a written response to them, which will be put out with it. On to just the last point we wanted to raise, just while we're getting the questions together. On the next slide, Christian, we are looking out for a fourth strategic farm to join us. So we are looking for a host there for 2021 to 2027. Cracking project to be involved in, especially through these transition years, and obviously entirely up to the host what they want to look at on their farm, as you've heard from our guys. So, you know, we'd urge anyone that's listening, if you want to get involved and kick off the project and look at things on your own farm, to take us forward, absolutely all more than welcome. So thank you firstly to everyone still there to join us. So one of the interesting questions you had, apart from the new fungicides, the rest of the chemistry predominantly protectant. So how do you decide what fungicide treatment to do, as the weather is totally an unknown phenomenon and predicts the disease pressure? So, I mean, we can pick a few bits off that. Weather and disease pressure, or nitrogen and disease pressure? We'll throw that open to the floor.
I would say just have a very open conversation with your agronomist and sort of look at it in a bigger picture, and then come up with a bit of a strategy. If you go less, then you know that you can go more next time round if the disease is still pushing on. So it's taking the advice, but every farmer needs to be out walking fields, looking, disease scoring, checking all the time, and that's something that I've sort of done more and more since sort of having a season where I snapped my cruciate knee ligament. It meant that I couldn't do any field walking. I was reliant on third-party information from other people, and so then making decisions like that was very difficult. So I've say just get out there to do it, and then have discussions. Social media is a good way of throwing it out there as well, sort of. So I would say make sure you take the best advice out there.
Be outstanding in your field, as they say. Yeah.
I think you got to be honest in what your yield potential is as well. Be honest with yourself. Don't be overly ambitious. Know the areas that you can feed and you can spend on, because you're going to get that return. But also, you know, we're all trying to be the top yielders, aren't we? But you got to be really, really honest with yourself on your average yield, what your ground can support, and on those lower yielding fields, lower yielding areas, you know, don't be afraid to bring it back.
Absolutely. Georgie, have you any takes on that? Or David? Sorry, on you go, David.
The question of nitrogen and disease, I think, is quite interesting. I'm fairly convinced now that the way we apply our nutrition to our crops, you know, big dollops of nitrogen in the spring as soon as we can travel, it puts the plant out of balance from day one in the growing season, and we're then playing catch up because, you know, the disease gets in, so we need a fungicide, and then we put some more N on and we need more disease, and it just seems to, the system just seems to feed the requirement for more and more input. Whereas, I mean, we've tried to do the nitrogen a little and often, but we find it very tricky at the minute, because you put a little on in March and then it doesn't rain for 2.5 months, and you all of a sudden you look like a bit of a wally. So we're trying to work out how we can get around that problem in the short term. But I certainly think that the way we've been educated or pushed or decided, however you want to put it, to apply our nutrition and feed our crops is certainly, it's been fighting against us, I think, compared to what we actually need to be doing. But we've got to re-educate ourselves somehow. That's going to be the difficult bit, I think.
Yeah, totally agree. When we done tissue analysis looking at sort of levels of nitrogen in the plants, and when you're applying 200 kilos of N, when you actually look at what's actually in the plant, that's over sort of 500 kilograms a hectare. Where the rest of that that's come from the soil. So it's really understanding that whole bigger picture. And it is very much a system approach, and it's very easy to pull the safety blanket off, but then say, oh, I'm just going to reduce one thing, or not going to apply a fungicide, or not going to apply something. But that's how you get fingers burnt very quickly, and you don't learn as quick. Whereas if you sort of know what system you're trying to deliver, that's where I would say you sort of be a bit more systematic approach is what we've sort of seen over the last few years here.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I mean, there is a skeptics, and you know, the whole last 100 years, it's been great, the transition through building yields, what you can do, all the rest. You know, there's been some great advancements there, but we do need to remember that most of the testing that's come along with that is to improve the efficacy of the products that we use, not to increase the plant health. And we're now at a stage where regulation is meaning that we're losing products left, right, and centre. You know, the list gets bigger and bigger. The green book is now a pamphlet, whereas actually the amount of chemistry that we're losing is becoming the book, and that's only going to get worse and worse. So, you know, I think going forward we do have to use the strategic farm to be strategic and to look into these things, without a doubt. And it's good to see that the hort world, you know, like I said, have been blown away coming into a few of their meetings and just hearing about the sort of things they're looking at and the different ways they do nutrition. So really grateful for being allowed into that as well, George. And just like to thank everyone for that. And in perfect timing, we can still go and watch Who's a Celebrity. I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out if you're good for that, isn't it? Perfect. Right, okay, upcoming, Strategic Farm Week webinars. Tomorrow's one, flowering strip seminar, and then on Friday, Ask the Researcher session, which is the trials hosts. So that'll be ADAS and SAC behind the Strategic Farm. So that'll be quite a good one on Friday as well, if you guys have time. And tomorrow's one perfect question to be asked there tomorrow: does nitrogen affect the aphid incidence in crops? Remember that one for tomorrow. Okay. So good night all, and be outstanding in your field. Yeah, thank you very much, Christian.